Hello everyone and welcome. Today we're going to talk about and rank the Void items in Risk of Rain 2. This new tier of items introduced by the latest DLC, Survivors of the Void, has some incredibly strong items and some interesting side grades. So let's find out how they match up against each other. Really quickly before we begin, I would just like to remind everybody that liking and subscribing are both greatly appreciated. They tell me that you like my content, and they tell YouTube that they should show my content to more people. But without further ado, let's get into the video. We're gonna start off the list with one of the rarest Void items, and that is the Benthic Bloom, which I am going to put in the C tier. The reason I put it that low is because Benthic Bloom is really just gambling your run on what items the Bloom upgrades your already acquired items into. Getting 5 stacks of ceremonial daggers can destroy pretty much any encounter, but getting 5 Rejuve, not so much. Part of the reason this is so risky is because it transforms an entire stack of items at once. That means that compared to something like the Egocentrism, which also takes items, instead of being able to get enough items to outstrip it, if you get unlucky, the Bloom can take as many items as you picked up on stage. This can actually give some benefit if you pick it up right before you're about to end a run at Mithrix. Having the Bloom proc once or twice and get a few upgrades but not destroy all of your items in the build that you've built can be quite good, but picking up the Bloom and then looping, or picking it up even at the beginning of a run and going to Mithrix at stage 5, can result in you having no movement speed and maybe no damage depending on what the Bloom upgrades your items into. All in all, I can't rate it higher than C. It could be really powerful, but the odds are pretty good it's not. It's just not consistent. Next is the Encased Key, which I think is going to go into the B tier. The power of the Encased Key is directly related to how much you value Void items. So it really depends what you're looking for in a run. If you already have a Clover, then maybe you don't want to risk getting more Plasma Shrimps. You want to keep your ATG. But also maybe not. It's preference. What I will say about this item, what makes it worth picking up more often than not, is that it does give you a choice. It gives you 3 options to pick from, which means you're more likely to find a Void item that you want. Oftentimes, I will pick up an Encased Key, especially if I have a Recycler, because that gives me an extra roll on those 3 items. Lost Seer's Lenses is our next item on the list, and this is going straight into the D tier. I think this item is garbage. I don't think it's garbage because its effect is bad in and of itself, but because it comes at the opportunity cost of losing the only reliable way to stack crit chance. And crit chance is incredibly powerful on almost all survivors. I will say that there are 2 survivors that I think make use of this item better than others. And those are Bandit, because he has guaranteed crits when attacking from behind, and Railgunner, who gets guaranteed crits when you can aim well. It has more value on Bandit than Railgunner because Railgunner still gets crit damage from stacking glasses, but she has so much damage in her kit anyway that I don't think it really matters. On those 2 survivors, I do consider picking up this item. On anyone else, I ignore it 100% of the time. Lysol is up next, and this one's kind of interesting. It's interesting because its opportunity cost is directly tied to whatever equipment you have. If you haven't been able to find anything but a strange fruit, there's not really any value to having Fuel Cell. Or if you're lucky enough to get one of the elite aspects, there is 0 value. Furthermore, Lysol is very polarizing based on what character you pick it up on. Picking up a Lysol on Bandit means that he can stack Desperado easier, Mercenary gets to increase his damage and invulnerability a lot, and Engineer gets a whole extra turret at 1 stack of Lysate, which basically multiplies every other item he's gotten by 400% instead of 300%. However, there are a lot of survivors where Lysol is just useless. Captain gets no benefit at all, and neither does Void Fiend. Artificer might be able to make use of it if she has the Flamethrower special, but with Ionic Surge, which is my preference because it can skip pillars, I would rather just have Fuel Cell. So while Lysate can be quite strong depending on the situation, its inconsistency makes me put it in the C tier. Needle Tick is our next item, and I think this one is going to go into the A tier for me. The DPS of this item compared to Tri-Tip Dagger is sometimes better and sometimes worse. If you can proc bleed a lot, I would say it's generally better to keep Tri-Tip. However, there was a nerf a while back that made Tri-Tip bleed and Shatterspleen bleed not stack, which means it's more efficient to have Needle Ticks in Shatterspleen. Granted, it's a bit of a gamble to say you're going to get Shatterspleen in a run, so if you're planning on going straight to Mithrix at stage 5, your items can be worth more keeping them as Tri-Tip, especially if you're playing a survivor like Commando who can proc on hit effects very consistently. The newly hatched Zoeia is our next item, and I think this is going to go into the B tier. The best thing about all of the Void allies that this summons is how incredibly tanky they are compared to any other allies that you can get. Their health scales incredibly well into the game, and that means they can draw aggro for a long time even if they don't do that much damage. This makes them useful on Mithrix and the Voidling, as well as some more difficult teleporter encounters. Their Void Explosion when they die as well can be very useful for clearing out certain enemies or crowds of enemies, but it can be a danger as well. Additionally, I should mention that the Zoeia is one of the few ally summoning items that Engineer's turrets can actually inherit. They will get their own Void allies, and that makes this a particularly tempting item on him. With that said though, there are several yellow items that just are not worth getting rid of. Shatterspleen and Charge Perforator are S tier items. If you have an Irradiant Pearl, there is no reason to ever get rid of it for a Zoeia. But if all you have are some normal pearls or a Queen's Gland, the Zoeia can be a good pickup, and that's why it's going into the middle of B tier. Next up is Plasma Shrimp, which is the ATG replacement. I actually think that the shrimp does live up to its counterpart for the most part. It gives consistency and synergizes very well with survivors that hit the enemy a lot, like Commando or Huntress. It also synergizes very well with any survivor that wants to stack shield items, whether that's with PSG or Transcendence. When it is not worth is if you have a survivor that doesn't have that many attacks hit that often, like Railgunner or Artificer without Flamethrower. It's also not worth on Engineer because the turrets have a hard time regenerating shield. They take a lot of aggro. And finally, if you have a Clover, that almost doubles the chance for ATG to proc, which makes ATG have much more value than Plasma Shrimp. But aside from some specific scenarios, I think that Shrimp is pretty good and worth picking up most of the time, and that's why it gets its spot in A tier. Pluripotent Larva is next. I thought about this item for a while because I wasn't sure if I wanted it to be S or A. On one hand, it's a free revive. On the other hand, if you have any glasses at all, your revive costs you. The thing that tipped my opinion on this matter was considering that if you do need the revive, that means without this item, you would have died and lost your run. So at least, even if it does corrupt your Lensmaker's glasses, it still gives you a second chance to finish your run. So this is still going to go into the S tier. I will say though that it may not be worth picking up if you already have a Dios, because that does give you your revive without the downside of corrupting all of your items. Polyloot is our next item, and this is going straight to the top of S tier. This item is pretty insane, to be entirely honest. While it does remove the ukulele's ability to help with AoE damage, it makes up for that by amping the single target damage immensely. The 3 hits when Polyloot is procced each have their own 0.2 proc chance, which means this item can stack debuffs and continue proc chains like almost no other in the entire game. And that's on top of the fact that it does good damage by itself. While it may seem unworth to lose the AoE damage of Ukulele if you don't have any other AoE damage items, there are far more AoE damage items in the game than there are incredible single target items like the Polyloot. So I would always recommend picking this up no matter who you're playing. Safer Spaces is also going into the S tier. Much like Polyloot was one of the best damage items in the game, Safer Spaces is probably the best defensive item in the game. This little tardigrade takes all of the RNG out of teddy bears, which are already good. The guaranteed damage block can get you out of sticky situations, and can be abused to make going through stages easier, because it blocks the damage from Void Cradles and Blood Shrines. While it might not be as effective as tougher times in very niche scenarios, like taking burn damage for example, I think the run-saving trade-off is more than worth it. Always pick these up. Singularity Band is next, and this is also kind of an interesting item. It has far less base damage than either Runal's or Chiaro's bands, and it takes twice as long to recharge. But on the other hand, it offers crowd control and AoE damage, and very importantly, the Singularity Band has a 1.0 proc chance. On builds with a lot of proc items, like ATGs, Molten Perforators, or Polyloots, this can start a proc chain that much out-damages the Reynolds and Chiaros. Also, the effective damage, because this has a large AoE, can be much higher if you catch only 3 or 4 enemies inside of the blast. There's also a very niche build that uses Blast Shower and Fuel Cells to make Singularity Band proc itself by cleansing the cooldown every time you use it. This can lead to exponential damage growth, but it can be very hard to pull off consistently. Overall, I'll give this item a B tier rating. Not because it's bad, but just because it requires specific items and situations to outvalue the other bands. Tentabubble is next, and this is going into the S tier. I think Tentabubble is outrageously strong. This item makes fighting Mithrix a joke, and on top of that, it removes the main weakness of Chronobauble, which is that it doesn't stack. Tentabubble stacks incredibly well, and its effect can be used on all survivors. There is one small downside, and that is Chronobauble has a guaranteed debuff proc, which means it's instrumental in proccing Deathmark. Tentabubble instead has a chance, which means it can take longer to proc Deathmark. For me personally, this trade-off is always worth it. I will always pick up Tentabubble, but it is something to keep in mind when you see it in your runs. Overall, very easy S tier for me. Then we have the Voidscentflame, which after much deliberation I put into the S tier, meaning it is always worth picking up. The reason for that is because for the most part, it's just free damage. The first time you hit something, you get a large burst of damage, and it can really help with crowd control situations like against a cloud of wisps. And unlike Will-o'-the-Wisp, you do get a proc on bosses like Mithrix and the Voidling. There are two things to keep in mind with this item though. Number one, once you get 2 of them, they can eat band procs, which might not be something you want. And second of all, if you're running a Forgive Me Please build, Will-o'-the-Wisp is a core part of that build, and getting rid of it does more harm than good. But for my money, running an FMP build is the only time I would ever not pick up this item. I think it is very good. And last but certainly not least is the Longus, which I think is the strongest healing item in the entire game. You're gonna be sprinting 99% of the time when you're playing Risk of Rain 2. You sprint to dodge attacks, you sprint in between shots, you sprint to get around the map, and that means you're always getting value from this very strong healing. And because it's percent based, that means that Longus scales incredibly well with other healing and health stacking items. While Eclipse 5 and above do not encourage healing or self-damage builds, like with Nuka-Hanas or Razorwire, on difficulties below that, those are very strong, and Longus is instrumental in making them stronger. But now I want to hear what you think. What are some of your favorite Void items? Did I miss something on this list? Or maybe one of these items has a use that I didn't mention? Let me know in the comments. Reading and responding to comments is actually my favorite part of making these videos. But regardless, I hope everyone enjoyed watching, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.